All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we check out great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, magnum opuses, tour de forces, usually from obscure sources, earth-shattering discoveries. In this case, we're looking at an earth-shattering discovery that occurred in the mid-20th century called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there were hundreds of different works within the scrolls, including all of the books of the Old Testament, except for Esther. And these were discovered in the mid-1900s. 20 miles from Jerusalem, and the scrolls generally, there's some contention, but generally date from the New Testament period, or perhaps a century, or maybe even 2 centuries before that. So the 1st century, or possibly the 1st century BC, possibly the 2nd century BC. And they were written by a group of very strict Jews, but the language that they use, which is mostly captured in what they call the sectarian material, things like the community rule and the Damascus document and some of the various commentaries on Old Testament books. These all, a lot of them speak in a jargon or a code or a I won't say dialect, but in a idiomatic language, using certain terms that are really echoed in the New Testament. And so the Dead Sea Scrolls have great bearing on the New Testament, which is needed because there is really no corroborating evidence for the New Testament. And some people might say, oh, well, what about Josephus? Josephus said, referred to Christ. Well, he's the only one, A. And B, he is not trustworthy because he is not only an agent of the Roman Caesars, but he's actually a family member of the Roman Caesars, adopted by the Emperor Vespasian in about 70 AD, and lived at the court of Rome. Josephus's work, the Antiquities of the Jews, well, that came out in the 90s, but War of the Jews came out in the late 70s, and these books, I believe both of them, were actually parts of the Bible at one point, throughout the Middle Ages, and they still are included in the original canon of the Bible by the preterists. So there's still one sect out there that uses Josephus as a actual book of the Bible. But he was nonetheless a Roman. He was a Jew, but he defected to the Romans. And if you read his book, War of the Jews, at the same time that you read the Old Testament, you will see that they are written by the same entity, whoever Josephus was. And there are parallel after parallel after parallel after parallel, with mocking humor, where Jesus predicts something is going to happen, prophecies that something is going to happen, and that thing is fulfilled by the Emperor Titus, who was the military general in the War of the Jews, of 66 AD, 66 to 73 AD. The Jews are fighting colonial war against the Romans, who are their colonizers. And the Jews were a big pain in the butt for the Romans. They were always insurrecting and revolting and refusing to, be good Romans, because the Jews had a separatist identification, still do. And if you look, I'm really more referring to like Orthodox, strictly biblical, chosen people kind of thing. And in steps the Dead Sea Scrolls. Josephus and the Gospels were really the only sources that we have for history from the 1st century until the arrival of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, it could be that the Dead Sea Scrolls are also fraudulent, a psyop, just like the Gospels and Josephus, written by the Romans as wartime propaganda against the Jews, positing a Prince of Peace and a Jew who was favorable to the Romans, believed in, forgetting about all that Jewish, circumcision and kosher laws and other dietary and sacrifice laws. Just drop all that so that we can, integrate with the Gentiles here. So that was mainly the motivation for writing the Gospels, but a secondary motivation was to mock and humiliate the Jews. And unfortunately, that has been transferred over to the Christians. And so, but the Christians don't realize that when they are worshiping Jesus, they're actually literally worshiping Titus Caesar, the Roman emperor from 79 to 81 AD, who fulfilled everything that Jesus prophesied, and whose 3-year military campaign in Judea parallels exactly Jesus's 3-year ministry in the exact same locations. Where Jesus goes, Titus goes. What Jesus does, what Jesus says, metaphorically, Titus fulfills literally. And we're gonna be going over that, I think, starting very soon. But right now we're looking at helping us with our decode of the Bible, with looking into the Dead Sea Scrolls and some of the other Apocrypha from the viewpoint of really the guy who unlocked the Dead Sea Scrolls, because that was the main problem, and why people don't know very much about the Dead Sea Scrolls these days. Most everybody has heard of them, but they don't know what they are or haven't read them, because they were discovered in the mid-40s to the mid-50s, but they were entrusted to an international team of scholars to translate them and catalog them and organize them. And these were mainly Catholic priests, and these guys read through the scrolls and saw a lot of stuff that they didn't like, because it didn't harmonize with their belief systems of, Catholicism. And so they began to just, divert and obfuscate and do everything that they could to avoid publishing on any of the explosive aspects of the sectarian material of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it took about 35 years or more before these things actually got out into the public for even for scholars. And Robert Eisenman was one of the main people that was the main person that kind of got these out there. And this is his book that is called the New Testament Code. And so he goes through all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which he calls over and over again, he says the Dead Sea Scrolls change everything. And but he also employs many of the other apocryphal texts, along with the works of many of the old church fathers and other historical commentators at that time, at any of the time between now and then. And also a lot of even Islamic material or pre-Islamic Arab material. And we're looking at his first chapter, which is called Preliminaries, and he's discussing how the last two episodes, he's gone through about 6 separate, maybe even 7 separate speeches given by Peter in the book of Acts that are just blatantly anti-Semitic, where he is blaming the Jews, not Judas, not any specific Jews, but just the Jews in general, for killing Jesus. And I posit that that's because that was written by the Romans. The Romans, had just gotten done with this 7-year war against the Jews. They were trying to cultivate, anti-Jew, anti-zealous Jew. They wanted the Hellenized Jews, the integrating Jews, who were, not so strict about all these things. One of the major things that the Jews really hated was that, when you put a bust of Caesar in the Jewish temple, that goes against their graven images thing, along with just being, humiliating, going against their monotheism thing, which, doesn't go back really that far. I would say that Jewish monotheism only goes back to the 6th century BC, but still, that was something that they were into. And the Romans were very tolerant of religion, but they wanted you to render unto Caesar what it was Caesar's. And so you had to worship the Caesar as well as whatever your religion was. So anyway, we're going through a quote that is in Acts 10, verse 28, and then a little bit of his analysis here. So I believe this is Peter. You know that it is not lawful for a Jewish man to join himself or come near one of another race. And I'm skipping a paragraph here, but it's kind of, I won't say redundant, but I read it the other time. So we're right back to where we started, right back where we finished last time. To repeat, this could not have been written by someone who was Jewish. Rather, it is how Jewish behavior might or would have appeared to non-Jewish and certainly jaundiced and even hostile eyes. In particular, this is how an anti-Semitic individual would have framed such an observation. Not patently the historical Peter, at least not as he is depicted in documents like the Pseudo-Clementines, unless, and the Pseudo-Clementines was an early romantic kind of picture of the same kind of story conveyed by Acts. like the pseudo-Clementines, unless, of course, one views Peter as a man hobbled by anti-Semitic stereotypes, which the present writer does not. The character delineated as Cornelius is also an impossibility, for it would not have been possible to find at this time a righteous and God-fearing centurion, quote, of the Caesarian contingent of Roman soldiers, quote, highly spoken of by the whole nation of the Jews, which is from Acts 10, verse 22, pious and doing many good works on behalf of the people and praying to God continually, as Acts 10, verse 2 puts it preceding this. Not only is it hard to refrain from outright guffawing here, this is an obvious inversion and clear overwrite, because, as even Josephus has attested, the Caesarian regiment of Roman soldiery was among the most brutal in Palestine. It was they, more than any other Roman troops, that goaded the Jews into revolt, so much so that when Titus, not someone particularly known for his liberality or largesse, and certainly not his concern for the Jews, had finally pacified the country in 70 AD, the Caesarian regiment was the first to be banished from it because of its previous record of unmitigated cruelty. In fact, like so many of these epithets, the descriptions, the righteous one, pious, highly spoken of by the whole nation of the Jews, and supplicating God continually, apply more appropriately to someone like James than anyone else can specify in this period. Anyone else one can specify in this period. Notwithstanding, even here I have already expressed the opinion that what one really has to do with is a refurbishment of the visit of a certain Simon, the head of an assembly of his own in Jerusalem, as described by Josephus, to the household of Agrippa I, who is a Herod, one of the Herod dynasties of puppet kings there in Judea, 37 to 44 AD. In Caesarea, to see what was done there contrary to law. The reason, of course, being that Agrippa I was perhaps the only Herodian highly spoken of by a goodly portion of the Jews, not only because of the Maccabean blood on his father's side, coming from Herod's original Maccabean wife, Miriam. And Herod had two consecutive wives named Miriam. And one was a Maccabean, and I think the other, I don't remember. I thought the other was Arab. But anyway, not sure about the second one. I'll try to find out. But also, contrary to the behavior of other Herodians, his self-evident attempts at conciliating his fellow countrymen. Even the Talmud portrays this Agrippa's concern to ingratiate himself over such matters. In other words, the Simon at this time in Josephus was a zealot who wanted to bar mixed blood persons or foreigners from the temple, not admit them, as Acts portrays its Simon, or Peter, his contemporary. But, as we shall see in the end, even the name Cornelius will have particular relevance towards some of the issues circulating in this period and beyond, especially the Lex Cornelia de Sicarius a Beneficis, the law of Cornelius of the Sicari, and I don't know that last word. My Latin is a little rusty, but attributed to the legendary Roman general Publius Cornelius Scipio, but probably not put into real effect until after the first Jewish revolt by Nerva, 96 to 98 AD, and repressively applied by Hadrian, the emperor from 117 to 138 AD, to discourage both revolution and circumcision across the board. Again, Peter repeats in the speech he now makes to this Cornelius on going into his house for perhaps the 7th or 8th time, depending, well, we'll forget that, 7th or 8th time, the usual blood libel. So this is the 7th or 8th time that Peter repeats the blood libel, like the Jews killed Jesus strain. If we had not got to the point by now, we would perhaps have gotten it after this. After describing how, quote, God anointed Jesus, who was from Nazareth, with the Holy Spirit and with power, end quote, and how Jesus then went around, quote, doing good and healing all who were being oppressed, significantly not by Rome, but by the devil. Again, another insertion again by the Romans, who pretty much at the same time that they created this Jesus, they also created the devil. That was kind of the trade-off. The Jews really don't have either, you know. I think the word Satan appears like 5 times in the Old Testament, and every time it's just like, it just means an obstacle or a impediment. But then in the New Testament, it gains this autonomy that it can actually do stuff that is not under the auspices of God. So it's kind of like Jesus is like an exorcism, or Christianity is like an exorcism of Judaism. So Peter now adds, which he did both in the country of the Jews and in Jerusalem, but whom they, the Jews, put to death by hanging on a tree. That's from Acts 10:39. The typical description of crucifixion Acts has already had Peter use in Acts 5:30 and used by Paul in Galatians 3:13. So in just the first 10 chapters of Acts, Peter goes into this blood libel 7 different times, which I think is pretty clear, fairly convincing evidence of it coming from the Romans. By way of introduction to these matters, Peter alludes to 2 points important in many descriptions of James the First. God is not a respecter of persons, which is a fundamental set piece of all early church descriptions of James, already highlighted above and parodied by Paul at the beginning of Galatians. Quote, do I persuade men or God, or do I seek to please men? It's in Galatians 1, verse 10. And then 2, in every nation, he who fears him, he who fears God and works righteousness is acceptable to him. That's in Acts 10:35, which is basically the approach of the Damascus document of the Dead Sea Scrolls, with its, or at least of the Qumran people, with its emphasis on works righteousness. And in particular, at the end of the exhortative section of the Cairo recension, where fearing God and God-fearers are several times evoked, to whom it's new covenant in the land of Damascus is also clearly addressed, but God-fearers who obey the law, not those who disobey it. Like Stephen's speech above, the very introduction, well, so what he's getting at is that the Romans are trying to move the Jews away from, these strict Jewish things. So instead, the Jews were trying to focus on being righteous according to the law, to follow the Torah, follow what's written in the Torah, in the Jewish Bible. But the Romans are wanting them to have it by faith instead, because that is, more wiggle room there. Like Stephen's speech above, the very introduction to these points, supposedly spoken by an angel of God, which I think is also a Roman thing, but to another of these ubiquitous certain ones, Acts is always referring to this, is reminiscent of the opening appeals of the Damascus document, which we shall further elucidate as we proceed. As Acts puts this, quote, "Now, therefore, hear all the things which God has commanded you, and opening his mouth, etc." Here again, the telltale plays on uncircumcising one's ears, eyes, and ultimately one's heart, we have already encountered in the speech attributed to Stephen above. In the Damascus document, the parallel position runs as follows. Quote, "Hear now, all of you who know righteousness and consider the works of God. Hear now, all you who enter the covenant, and I will unstop your ears." And later, "And God shall heed their words and will hear, and a book of remembrance shall be written out before him for God-fearers and those considering his name, until God shall reveal salvation and righteousness to those fearing his name." So, that's the end of the quote. In the last line, as we shall have cause to repeatedly point out as we progress too, the reference will actually be to seeing Jesus or seeing his salvation. Quote, "And their ears will be strengthened, and they shall be victorious, and they shall see his salvation, because they took refuge in his holy name." So, what Eisenman is basically getting at is that when you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls and some of these other apocryphal documents, a very different picture emerges than what you get if you're just looking at the Gospels. If you're looking at the Gospels, you're looking at pretty much Roman propaganda that is attempting to mock you and really belittle you and deceive you, and to move you away from, observance of the law, and move you in the direction of faith, salvation through faith. And the faith that you have in Jesus is actually the faith that you have in Titus Caesar, who takes the spot of Jesus in all the prophecies, and including the ones that we're looking forward to in Revelation that we think that haven't come yet. All of the prophecies from Revelation have already taken place in the first century, no less. And anyway, that is the end of that first chapter. Now, the second chapter is called The Attack by Paul on James. the Memorial Mausoleum at Qumran, and the James Ossuary. We probably are going to get back and read a lot of this book, but the book is like 1,000 pages, and right now we're going to move back over to the Joseph Atwill approach of the Flavian signature. And so I think we're going to start that up tomorrow. Go over the parallels, a lot of the, at least to start going, scratching the surface of going over the parallels. In this case, between the Book of Luke and the War of the Jews. And there are parallels in sequence where they occur at the same place, they occur at the same part of the story, and there are parallels between the occurrences. But they occur like 40 years apart, and one predicts the other, and you can see that there are clear parallels, and they are clearly steering you in the direction of pro-Roman, anti-Jew, and, forget about the law and just worry about what you believe in. And so we'll see that as we go into the Flavian signature tomorrow. Meanwhile, thanks for tuning in today. Hope you come back for the Flavian signature. It's going to be very, I think, explosive. It's, in my mind, it is the best proof that I've seen for the psyop that is the Roman Gospels. And I think it's incontrovertible proof, because the Romans actually literally signed their name to the book of Luke in particular, but really all of the New Testament. Okay, not to say that, the Old Testament, we're going to get into the Old Testament later, but, basically, if I have to say it, Christianity from the New Testament is a big step up from the Old Testament. The Old Testament is a big step up from Satanism. And so that's kind of the hierarchy there, but all of them are limited hangouts, more or less, or, psyops to limited hangouts. Anyway, thanks for tuning in today, and have a